All right, kia ora, everyone. It's Nathan Rose from Capgemini here in beautiful Auckland, New Zealand. Welcome to today's completely irresponsible demo of low-code PowerFX plugins. One of my favorite things about the Power Platform is that there's always a way to do something even when there doesn't seem to be a way, and today's one of those days. Now, as I've demoed low-code PowerFX plugins at user groups and forums over the past few weeks, two of the questions that I regularly get are, number one, is it possible to use instant plugins outside of Canvas apps and custom pages? And secondly, is it possible to run low-code plugins asynchronously? And I'm excited to show you that the answer to both of these questions is yes. Now, first things first, before we get into the demo, these features are experimental at the moment, and one of my favorite things about experimental and preview features in the Power Platform is we get to work out what's possible, not necessarily what's responsible. What's responsible comes later as these features approach GA, and we have to ask questions about, okay, we can do this, but would we actually do this in a production scenario? So with that in mind, let me share my screen and let's get into the demo. Now, we're going to be using our old friend Power Automate today. Power Automate has an action in the Dataverse connector called Perform Unbound Action. And what that lets you do is call plugins in Dataverse. So everything from the out of the box actions and plugins that come with the Power Platform to C# plugins that your devs write to low code plugins that you and I can write in PowerFX. And so what I'm doing is I've got a flow set up to run when I toggle a flag field in my model-driven app from no to yes. So I'm cheating a little bit, and that's going to trigger this flow to run to then use the unbound action to call my low-code plugin. Now, one of the first plugins I wrote comes straight from the documentation from the PowerFX team, and this is a simple calculation, just adds A plus B to give me C. It's an instant plugin, so the user triggers it by interacting with an element in the Canvas or app or custom page. But what I can do in Power Automate is I can take those inputs that I would be setting in PowerFX in a Canvas app, and I can do this programmatically in PowerFX. And then once that's plugins run, I can take the output from the plugin and I can stick it on my row in Dataverse. So let's go over to the model-driven app and let's see how this works. All right, so this is my table. I've got a couple of columns here that are going to be input into the plugin, and it's going to stick it here. So again, we'll trigger this from no to yes, cheating a little bit, but again, we're working out what's possible today, not necessarily what's responsible. We'll go ahead and save. Now this flow is going to start to run. All right, so our flow has run. Let's come back here to our row and refresh it. And you can see that the plugin's been triggered. So we've got an instant plugin that normally would have to be triggered by a user doing something in a Canvas app, and we've been able to trigger it automatically within a model-driven app and just use Power Automate. Now, the first question in your mind is if you are already using Power Automate to trigger this, why wouldn't you just do the simple calculation in Power Automate and stick it on the row? It's a very good question. I don't have a good answer to that other than I'm doing this because it's cool. But again, in a production scenario, I definitely wouldn't do it this way. So the other thing is that this does trigger our plugin somewhat asynchronously. So the plugin logic is synchronous, that will run synchronously, but the execution of it has been triggered by Power Automate, which is asynchronous. So let's move on to a scenario where we might consider doing it this way in production. So one of the other features of low-code plugins, specifically the instant plugins that a user triggers by interacting with the app, is the ability to connect with SQL Server and trigger a stored procedure. So I've got a plugin that I demoed a few weeks ago that simply takes a few rows from Dataverse and writes it to a table in SQL. Let's say we need to keep an audit trail outside of Dataverse. We need to integrate with an ERP or another system or something like that. You could do it this way. But let's say that we don't want the user to have to wait around while this plugin runs. So we just want the user to save and move on, and we want to send this to SQL in the background via the low code plugin. So let's see this in action. So I've got my flow. This is working exactly the same way as the other flow. The only difference is I'm not going to send an update back to Dataverse once I've written to SQL. So let's go and see this in action. So again, this is going to run when the row updates. So I've got this row that I've created. I've got some details that I'm going to send to SQL. Let's go ahead and trigger this plugin. We'll save. Let's come over here, see this flow run. You can see the flow is running. That's run. And let's take a look in SQL. And you can see that we've just created our row. So that's a slightly more plausible example of when you might use Power Automate and low code plugins together in this way. Although Power Automate also has the ability to connect with SQL and run stored procedures. So it's kind of a toss up. But again, while this is in preview, we're working out what's possible. And I'm really excited to have just shown you that we can trigger instant low code plugins automatically via Power Automate, and we can trigger our instant low code plugins asynchronously using Power Automate. Now, one more thing that I will call out is that the only plugins that are available to you in the um, perform unbound action step in Power Automate are your instant plugins. So if you create an automated plugin in PowerFX Plugins, they won't show up here. So that's just one more thing to note. But that's today's completely irresponsible demo of low-code PowerFX plugins interacting with Power Automate. I hope this was helpful. Let me know what you think. Drop a comment. Thanks so much for watching.